Pioneer brand canola with Optimum Gly, the highest yielding glyphosate-tolerant trait on the market. What's next in canola happens here.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio. Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Shaun Haney, your host here on this Wednesday midweek edition of the show. Hey, thanks so much everybody for making RealAg Radio and Rural Radio 147 a big part of your workday. And of course, also a big shout out to everybody listening out there on the RealAg Radio podcast, wherever you are doing that, Spotify, Apple, or any of the other 100 platforms that offer podcasts. We appreciate you joining us here today. Okay, Wednesday, we're going to do some RealAg markets today. We're going to be joined by Jon Driedger of LeftField Commodity Research. We're going to talk about the corn market, the canola market, pulses, spring wheat. I got questions, as well as what is happening on the biofuel front in the U.S. and in Canada. Seems to be some very uncertain times. We're coming off, you think about 12 months ago, it was very bullish on the potential for biofuels, renewable diesel, SAF, ethanol, of course, has been around for quite some time. But things seem a little bit more cloudy right now, a little bit more uncertain, some political risk, some capital risk. And speaking of capital, by the way, we've got the Bank of Canada dropping the rate 50 basis points. That is going to be a spark. I was talking to a friend of mine who is in the home building industry this morning, and he was like, this is great news for the Canadian economy. If you've got a lot of debt, especially on a variable basis, you are going to be feeling pretty good here today, or at least a little encouraged about lowering the cost of some of that debt, carrying that debt. As well, if you maybe potentially signed a mortgage, say a month ago, feeling a little less great if you got a fixed mortgage, 50 basis points. That was what a lot of people were expecting and arguing for, that needed to happen. We'll have to now follow and see what happens with the Federal Reserve in their next meeting coming up soon. Also today on the show, we're going to be talking to Sara Wyant. She is the CEO and founder of AgriPulse. She is based out of Missouri and spends a lot of time in Washington, D.C. And Sara is one of the big-time experts in the U.S. when it comes to agricultural policy. We're going to talk to her about, of course, get a bit of an election preview between Vice President Harris and former President Trump. It is a very close race, depending on which poll you believe. You're going to, come with a bit of a different result, but it is tight. What does it mean for the Farm Bill? And what does it mean for agricultural trade going forward? I got some questions on that, whether we have President Harris or President Trump. Who is going to be the trader that Canada is looking for? There are some major challenges, I think, in both directions, and a whole bunch of other ag policy issues, talking to Sara as well. If you have any feedback on today's program, you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also find Real Agriculture across all the different social media platforms. You're also more than welcome to call the Real Ag feedback line. Now, that number is 855-776-6147. Got an email here for feedback from Jean. And Jean says, I love hearing from real farmers. I also want to say I enjoy listening to Lindsay's show. Along with the government side of farming and ranching, I have learned so much from all of you. Thank you for doing what you do. Well, thanks a lot, Jean. I appreciate that very kind email. Everybody be more like Jean. Send some emails, thoughts, comments, perspectives. We want to hear from you. Okay, let's take a break. And when we come back, we got Jon Driedger, LeftField Commodity Research, joining us right after this.
Get ready for tillage season with the high-speed disc from Brandt. Cut and size residue, create ideal seed beds, and level ruts faster than any other tillage machine. It's a better field finish and fewer passes, so you can stay on schedule no matter what fall throws at you. And right now, you can get yours with a $12,000 rebate. There's never been a better time to bring your operation up to speed. Visit Brandt.ca for details.
Welcome back to Real Ag Radio. I am Lindsay Smith. Joining me now is Amy Crozier. She's the Senior Ag Specialties Rep for Nutrien, thinking about removal, but also think about nutrient uptake. So what our crop is going to need. How do we put those two things together when we're thinking about our purchasing decisions for the next year?
So it's very important to soil test. Know your geography. Are we short on water? Is our yield potential 30? Is our yield potential 50? Understanding what we're going for and aiming for, what's in our soil. Did we have disease issues? Did we have low proteins? Did we not meet our expectations? Is there nothing left in the tank when we're finishing off our crop? Did we have maturity issues? So all these different things put together can help influence those decisions. Maybe we want to change our strategy to have some season-long feeding products, depending on what our soil test tells us and what our crop is telling us when we're taking it off.
Where can farmers and their advisors go for more information?
You can go to our website, it's smartnitrogen.com.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio here on this Wednesday midweek edition of the show. Hey, calling all Montana, Dakota, and northern Minnesota growers. Pay attention, everybody. The new Seed Omega-3 canola production system can help you unlock a guaranteed path to market with attractive premium opportunities. First-in-class agronomy support and free on-farm pickup after harvest. To learn more, go to omega3canola.com. That's farmers in Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Minnesota. We are joined right now on RealAg Radio to talk markets by Jon Driedger of LeftField Commodity Research based out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Hey, John, how are we doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you, Shaun?
Doing good. I feel really good today. High energy, which maybe is a bit of a different description than the markets. They've been a little less energy, not going down, but not necessarily going up either.
Yeah, we've been kind of range bound. I mean, I guess the one exception a little bit is canola has had a pretty nice run, but really, by and large, sort of in aggregate, we've kind of been range bound. We set a lot of those futures markets set their lows kind of in late August. Market was probably a little too pessimistic, had a run up. Funds were heavily short, got some short covering. Now we've sort of pulled back from the highs, and we've sort of settled into a bit of a range. And again, every crop maybe has its own story a little bit, but in some ways that's fitting in the sense that most markets are not excessively tight, and yet, you get good buying on the lows, and we've sort of settled into a bit of a sideways pattern. It's a little ho-hum in some ways, really.
I guess a positive is even with strong corn yields out of the Midwest, we're dealing with that supply well from a pricing perspective in the market.
Yeah, I think so, and I think we've been seeing like a combination of things again as you get towards the lows. I mean, first of all, I think there has been pretty good end user buying. You uncover some demand. I think generally the farmer is in pretty good shape that he can be a patient seller. And so generally they've maybe been holding on a little bit tighter at the lows. Does slow farmer selling, does that, drive a rally? No. Does that maybe help provide a little bit of support in the market? I think it can. And so, I think that's where we help establish a bit of a floor on some of these markets, even if they're reasonably well supplied. But, again, if the supply is there, that does simply put on a bit of a ceiling. The market runs up. Maybe the U.S. becomes a little less competitive in global markets. Young farmers catch up on some selling. You put in a bit of a ceiling, and again, it sort of lends itself to a bit of a sideways range at this stage of the game. And I think particularly now as the weather yield equation kind of is behind us for the Northern Hemisphere.
We start to focus on demand, right? And there's been tons of focus on the U.S. trade deficit for agriculture. It's a big time concern south of the border for sure. You mentioned canola and it being, having a little bit of a better time as of late. What's driving that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things I think with canola, and it's kind of, I mean, it is fascinating, and we, in some ways, some of these markets have been a little bit boring in some ways, and yet canola has been a unique story, and there, I mean, there's two parts. I mean, one certainly is the Canadian crop is maybe smaller than folks were thinking earlier in the year, so we got a smaller supply, and that's helping underpin canola, maybe in contrast to, for example, the good yields in the U.S. for corn and soybeans. The other thing with canola as well is so, China announces this investigation into, anti-dumping. And so kind of the expectation is that suddenly China, our primary export market, is going to not take any Canadian canola, but that hasn't come into place yet. And so we're having this massive pull as importers in China is trying to maybe get ahead of what is, likely or expected tariffs coming on board. And so, you got this really strong pull from the export market there. The other part as well is we're seeing rapeseed prices in the EU push higher. Their production is smaller. So, canola is one of those markets that globally is actually quite tight, both in Canada and internationally. And so, there's a little bit more of a story, if you will. And part of it, I think, again, is trying to get ahead of what is expected to be a slowdown in purchases from China or stop altogether. So there's almost a bit of a stampede to get ahead of that, and that's contributing here to canola here in the interim.
Yeah, when the news broke of China and the investigation of anti-dumping, we dropped to what $100 a ton, lower than where we are today. We're almost exactly in that sense. So the bit of an overreaction. So and that's why a lot of people were saying be patient through this time. That has proven to be a good strategy if you followed that advice. There is a lot of speculation out there. In some cases, I'm not sure if one person said it at a meeting and everybody's like, "Oh, I heard somewhere." It's kind of how rumors can spread fast and furious on some of this because we don't have confirmation. But there is somewhat of an expectation that China at some point, whether it's this fall or in the new year in Q1, will apply some sort of a tariff on Canadian canola. But they may have a lot of our 24 crop before we actually get to that. And then all of a sudden this becomes more of a 25 story. We have, like you mentioned, we have front loaded a lot of the exports. We're trying to push as much through the system as we possibly can. That's why the rail strike ending was so critical for a crop like canola. 25 crop of canola seems to be a little bit more of a tricky wicket in the meantime, though.
Yeah, no, that's very true, Shaun. And kind of backing up half a step, in hindsight, it's obvious, but we certainly felt at the time as that market got crushed. In some ways, it's a natural knee-jerk reaction based on the headline, and yet, as you say, like let's just see a little bit how this plays out. That's probably too pessimistic, and of course, that's what we've seen. And every week that there isn't a tariff put in place, more canola moves, and as you mentioned, we've already moved a good chunk of what our full year export forecast is, and so. That does roll into a 2025 story. And so, in terms of what that means, like there's so many, I mean, until we have answers, you just simply don't know. And so, one thing that certainly we think about is, so for example, if China essentially stops taking anything from Canada, ultimately, like, are they gonna either then not take, a canola or rapeseed period, or are they going to try and pull in from other countries? Because really, Australia would probably be the only other alternative that could provide canola in any kind of volume that China uses. And yet, at this point, Australia is not really able to export to China. So then would China open up to Australian canola? And I think there's a lot of work being done in that regard. And if that's the case, in some ways, from a longer term perspective, or at least as long as tariffs are on, that's probably the best thing that could happen for Canada, because then a whole bunch of that Australian canola moves into China, and it's more a shuffling of trade flows. Whereas if China just kind of tries to muddle through without, well, now, there's a big demand hole, and that's a really, kind of a key piece of how this unfolds going forward, and it, backs into politics and regulatory decisions and those sorts of things. But yeah, looking ahead to 2025 again, I mean, obviously, we'd love to have China taking Canadian canola. That's the best case scenario. But maybe the next best scenario is if they're not taking Canadian canola, they'll take Australian canola, and then Canada kind of slides in and fills in a bunch of those markets that Australia now won't be servicing. That's
the
not
readjustment
ideal.
Of the trade flows, right?
Correct. Yeah, totally. Right. It's maybe not ideal, but it's like that's, I don't know, livable, or whatever language you want to put around that. But of course that's uncertain. So that's the cloud of uncertainty that we're operating under.
Let's talk about our other uncertain topic, one that feels maybe a little bit less clear on where it's headed, is the ability to export pulses to India. We have obviously a lot happening in the mainstream news in regards to that, the lack of diplomatic friendliness between the two countries. What's happening from a trade perspective? Is product still flowing to India?
Yeah, well, that's a good question in terms of the longer term as well with India and certainly so first of all, for example, something like peas and extending the tariffs and I think as we track pea prices in India, it seems likely that they wouldn't be extending their zero tariffs anyway. But within all of that, first of all is yeah, there's a question as to whether what is India going to import in the first place. And then second, would there be something formally against Canada? Is it just sort of maybe informal based on maybe not a specific government policy, but maybe they're just not buying? The other part as well is one of the things we sometimes forget about is that there's other countries as well that we compete with into Australia. Whether it's Australia with lentils, whether it's maybe Russia with peas, some of those other suppliers as well. So first of all, how much is India going to import? How much is going to come from Canada? And how much of that may or may not be influenced by, again, a diplomatic spat that has nothing to do with the Canadian farmer, and yet, of course, it's sometimes we feel like we have a bullseye on us because in our disputes with some of these countries, it's ultimately ag products that end up being a primary
Yeah.
primary item that we ship there, and so that's just kind of the reality of the current environment, unfortunately.
Which is why, a lot of there's proponents of increasing domestic processing. That's why they're, such champions of that, because it gets you out of this retaliation against the raw commodity, less likely to get, punishment applied to some of the, the more of moving up the value chain. So
Mhm.
and we have to be cautious here because, obviously canola publicly traded, like, we can see the price movement from the futures market. I think from a specialty crop standpoint on pulses, it's not traded on a futures exchange. And so it's a little bit harder to understand what's actually happening behind the scenes at times like this. And we can't just assume that bad news between the two countries, they're not going to buy any pulses. That's not exactly how this works.
No, and you're right. I mean, certainly the transparency that comes with the futures market, like with canola, certainly helps. In a crop like peas, it's large enough. It's sort of, there's enough buyers and it's widely traded enough that you can get a reasonable indication. But again, it's certainly not the same as in a futures market. And in terms of, how is I don't know, let's say risk priced into the market and that sort of thing. It's not, yeah, it's just simply not as transparent. And so it's a little, yeah, it's hard to get a great sense exactly how that's what's sort of unfolding underneath the surface, certainly.
Are you still a sell the rally guy, or how are you feeling about this market right now?
Like by and large, I think probably a sell the rally, buy the dips type of a mindset, probably for most markets is probably pretty, I think that's probably a fair way to approach it. Again, you probably could have a couple of markets where, I guess I'll phrase it this way, in some ways you think about what's the range of outcomes, like I think you could argue that there's a couple markets where there is some potential, say, positive skew, if you will. You could build scenarios where there's maybe more upside potential than downside risk. That might not be the most likely scenario, but in I think a couple of these markets, it's not a stretch to say if a couple dominoes fall, there could be more aggressive upside. And I think for example, one like canola, and of course we know some of the risks if China stops buying and they don't take from Australia, those sorts of things. Absolutely, that's a possibility. But it is tight globally. It's tight in Western Canada. And if we start looking further ahead, if for example, maybe we expect maybe acres will be down a little bit next year. If yields are a little bit disappointing again, it's not hard to see if our crush is cranking away at a good pace. It's not hard to see where potentially, you could see some, more aggressive upside in something like canola. It's not inevitable. I don't even know that that's the more likely scenario, but that's not a stretch. You look at something, for example, like wheat. It's really tight on paper globally. Some challenges in Russia, dry in the U.S. Winter wheat growing regions. If that extrapolates into some challenges next year, and again, you have a couple of ifs stacked up, that's a market where there could potentially be some upside skew. Again, I don't know that's the most likely scenario, and probably your base scenario, working in a bit of a sell the rallies, buy the dips type of a mindset, is the more likely scenario. But I guess if you use trader language, buying out of the money call options in some of those markets might not be the worst bet, even if they're maybe not the most likely
Still going to
scenario.
participate in the
So
upside if you do that.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Hey, Pioneer brand canola with Optimum Glide, the highest yielding glyphosate tolerant trait on the market. What's next in canola happens here. Go to pioneer.com/Canada to find out more. Of course, Optimum Glide, also the sponsor of Real Agriculture's Agritechnica coverage from last year. You can continue to find those videos at realagriculture.com and on our YouTube channel. We're talking markets here today with Jon Driedger of LeftField Commodity Research, and we'll be right back on RealAg Radio, Rural Radio 147, right after this.
Your co-op grow team are your local experts because we live here too. Our agronomic specialists stay up to date with the latest research and technology to help support your entire farm operation. Talk to our team for advice tailored to your farm's needs. We have recommendations to help you optimize your crop yield and quality while enhancing the health of your land. Co-op, we're all growing together. Here for your farm, here for your family. Learn more at coop.crs/farm.
Infuse some energy into your next corporate event, customer meeting, or conference with RealAg Radio, Canada's national agriculture radio show. Create a unique experience at your next event with host Shaun Haney, broadcasting RealAg Radio live on SiriusXM, featuring exciting guests, captivating interviews, and the latest news from the agriculture community. Contact advertising at realagriculture.com or call 587-787-1795 to book your on location with RealAg Radio today.
There's a reason we call it the Corn School. Videos on everything from planter setup to weed control, field trial results, and the latest yield strategies. The Corn School on realagriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from realagriculture.com, or as a podcast in your favorite podcast app. Check out the latest Corn School episode today.
Along with the extra time and lower instances of unpredictable weather, there are a variety of benefits that come with fall ESN application. Learn more at smartnitrogen.com. That's smartnitrogen.com. We're talking markets here today with Jon Driedger of LeftField Commodity Research. Jon, we've kind of covered what's been happening in canola and corn, as well as pulses. We've been doing a lot of features lately about, one of the big demand drivers is biofuels. And it really feels right now, it's a little bit cloudy. We got political risk. I would say in some cases we had capital risk because of, within the rising interest rate environment. Of course, those are coming down. We had the 50 basis point cut by the Bank of Canada here today. So that's leaving us a little bit, but it just feels like this biofuel market is very uncertain right now in Canada and in the U.S.
No, I agree, Shaun. I feel very much the same way. So much uncertainty, right? So much uncertainty, and it's one of those, where you're uncertainty based on people making decisions, and sometimes when we're chatting with farmers or industry, like we're in an industry where agriculture, there's a lot of weather uncertainty, and if you don't like weather uncertainty, we're in the wrong business. Whether you're a farmer, whether you're an analyst, or whatever the case is, that we can sort of handle, and we sort of chose that. But there's so much uncertainty where we're trying to basically, where the path forward in a lot of these markets, more than ever, is based on people making decisions, often maybe for political reasons or those sorts of things. And I think in terms of particularly with renewable diesel, renewable fuels, there's just enormous uncertainty, and people don't know, and these are huge long-term decisions that are being made, and people don't know what's going to happen even months from now, in terms of what what that looks like. So it's an enormous challenge.
Yeah, well, and when you say people don't know, I think it's even the people that that I lean on all the time that are really in the mix in the biofuel sector in Canada and in Washington, D.C. And we're going to have Sara Wyant from AgriPulse on RealAg Radio here today. I'm going to ask her about what's happening with 45Z, that tax credit when it comes to renewable diesel and SAF. And she will likely say we're not really sure because the Treasury Department has been so quiet about what their intentions are. And they're never going to say, but I would love to be the fly on the wall in some of these corporate boardrooms of some of the crushers that intend to spend hundreds of millions of dollars And there is so much political risk. We could have a change of government in Canada. We could have a change of government in the US. And at one time, it was like, you know what? Either side of the aisle is supporting biofuels. There's a lot of reasons for it. That feels way less clear here right now.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think a little bit, for example, say when the ethanol boom and wave kind of first started, of course, we're going back quite a few years. And it sort of felt like at the time, and as you mentioned, sort of both sides of the aisle, the ag industry loved it, the defense industry loved it, less reliance on foreign oil. Everybody loved it. There was enormous amount of political capital. There was an enormous amount of actual capital invested, and it felt like that was just, it had momentum, and it wasn't going to, and maybe the pace of momentum, it ebbs and flows a little bit, but it was going in a clear direction. And I agree with you. It just feels a little different this time in the sense that there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, of course, and it's been talked ad nauseum about how everybody's even more polarized than they've ever been. And so, yeah, there's just a lot more uncertainty. I think it's less inevitable, than it felt like, say, with, again, ethanol going back, in the early stages of that boom. It's not as inevitable as things seemed at the time. And again, that's anytime you have demand that's basically determined by, the stroke of a regulator's pen. I mean, there's just simply greater policy risk to that than your, say, traditional, more normal, typical demand. And yeah, that's an enormous challenge. I mean, I don't know, making big long-term decisions in that kind of when uncertainty is so high, even in the short term, that's an enormous challenge.
Like at 100,000 feet, there's a lot of reasons to be bullish, right? On biofuels. And I've been to a lot of conferences. You've been to a lot of conferences. When this topic comes up, it's all from the bullish on demand standpoint. But I don't know. If I was heavily invested in, some of these crush facilities right now, based on the opportunity of renewable diesel, I would feel a little bit more skittish, right? When you got skittish capital, you need capital to grow an industry. There's one thing to have government support and government programs and regulations. You need that to support, the investment. But if you've got skittish capital, then you've got a problem. And I just wonder that's worrying me here right now.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Shaun. It's just people just don't know, and it's also, that's the federal level, but then, for example, each state, and all the different jurisdictions, they have their own programs in place as well. And so, there's the federal component. Again, individual states, individual provinces, like I think just everybody just has a real difficult time, and those are changing, whether it's policy, whether it's how policy is implemented in the shorter term and the longer term. I mean, as you mentioned, people that certainly we rely on and you chat with regularly, that would be well tapped in, if you will, and a lot of them just sort of shrug their shoulders and say, we just don't know, and that's for just around the corner, never mind, looking ahead, 5-10 years, these large investments, that's a multi-decade project. And, I'm not sure how you make, good decisions in that environment. That's a really difficult.
Yeah. Hey, before I let you go, I got to ask you about wheat, spring wheat. Can you tell me if I have inventory unsold on 24 crop of spring wheat, what am I doing? Because I look at the spring wheat charts and I get somewhat confused on which direction I should feel this is all going.
Yeah, the wheat market, I mean, it's, to be quite honest, it's probably one that's maybe felt more frustrating over the last couple of years than almost any, because if you look at it, it's been tight, sort of quote unquote on paper for a long time. Global stocks and the major exporters tight. Major exporter, for example, something like Ukraine and Russia, war in the region, major exporters, the market kind of shrugs its shoulders and doesn't seem to care. It feels like, certainly for any bulls in that market, it's been incredibly frustrating. And yet, as you mentioned, if you think about if a couple of dominoes fall, there could be potentially huge upside skew. And yet anyone who's sort of been banking on that has been horribly disappointed for the last, 24 months. I think in terms of the wheat, we're not negative wheat prices. I think probably range bound. I think, let's just say your base scenario is probably maybe some firming as we go on into the year. But at the same time, I think this market has shown that it's able to kind of muddle through a lot of uncertainty and a lot of, again, tight stocks, quote unquote, on paper without driving that market higher. So
yeah, John, I don't like when a market goes, say, moves in one direction, the fundamentals don't support at least the nature of the move. And of course, funds are going to move it too high, too low. Like that overshoot's going to happen on both sides. But when we move in a direction and the fundamentals don't support it, that's weak to me. When the fundamentals potentially support a move and it doesn't happen, that frustrates the people that have inventory.
Yeah, no question, Shaun. And it certainly forces you to ask some questions. And I think the one thing with wheat that makes me a little wary is there are some questions on the import demand side. So maybe is demand just a little softer than folks are thinking, or at least a little quicker to just ease off if prices run up a little bit, which again lends itself to a little bit of that range bound kind of environment like we were chatting about earlier. So, I think one of the things with wheat, and so for example, if you're a farmer in Western Canada, we're going to see a good export program this year. I think we're going to see good export movement, and what we kind of have seen over the last period of time in that kind of environment is if a person, first of all, you want to have a good handle on what the quality is that you got, and you shop your samples around, and I think inevitably, you'll be able to maybe catch one of these exporters that's putting together a bit of a program, and maybe they're hitting some targets, or they put on some specials or those sorts of things. Maybe you can sell into a bit of a deferred window and capture some of that carry in the futures market. And then somewhere along the line, if you can capture a bit of a pop and then sell in a deferred window and grab a little bit more, that's probably, your safest bet. And I think that's a reasonably high percentage scenario of that happening. Don't chase the lows when it moves up a little bit. And again, if it can capture a little bit of carry, I think one of the gifts sometimes in the market for farms that can be patient is just, getting paid to store that grain a few extra months,
if you got the carry. Yeah.
If you can get the carry, if you can get another 25 odd cents a bushel or 30 cents a bushel for sitting on it a little bit, well, that's a 30-cent rally in the spot market or futures market or whatever it is that's already, bird in the hand. And so, in a market like wheat, I agree. It's been frustrating. If it's not behaving as it should, that is a bit of a flag. And so, for wheat farmers, again, every farm's got a different needs and those sorts of things. But you can be patient, take advantage of the carry. That might be your best bet to wring what you can out of that market.
Okay, so best bet. Speaking of best bets, before I let you go, okay, do you take that carry? You take that money instead of putting it in your pocket, you put it on the Jets to win the cup? Is that what you're doing, John? Is that
I don't know if I'd put it on the Jets to win the cup. They're off to a great start, but I mean, they haven't exactly had a murderer's row of teams to play yet. So we're happy with a 6-0 start, and we'll be a little wary about getting too far ahead of ourselves. Although it's the start's been good. Hellebuyck looks good, so that helps.
Maybe the two surprise teams of the year so far are the Flames and the Jets. Which
there you go. Who'd have thought?
No way to go but down. That's how I look at it.
That's right. Sell the rally.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, John, thanks a lot for joining us here today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I always appreciate it, Shaun. Thank you.
That is Jon Driedger, LeftField Commodity Research based out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Check them out. Great research, great analysis. John and Chuck both. And they join us regularly here on RealAg Radio. Hey, I want to talk to you about a New Farm. Their pre-emergent soil-active herbicides, Valterra EZ and Fierce EZ from New Farm. Get ahead of hard-to-kill weeds. Spray this fall for up to 8 weeks of extended weed control next spring. Find out more by going to newfarm.ca. We'll be right back on RealAg Radio with Sara Wyant of AgriPulse right after this.
If you only listen to RealAg Radio, you only get half the picture. For greater insight into the issues that affect farming, tune in to RealAgriculture.com. Crops, livestock, machinery, farm management, and the markets, even food and travel. Real Agriculture Online digs deeper into the topics that affect the way you work and live. So get connected today. Read, watch, and listen to the people who know at RealAgriculture.com.
What were the issues in your fields this year? Did you do a soil sample? What is your soil sample telling you about some of the nutrient issues that you might be having going into next year? What herbicides did you use? What residues you might be concerned about? What weed issues did you have? What crop residues did you have? How well do you know your fields?
Get the answers to all the questions you have about your pulse crop at the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio. Hey, you're invited to the Future Fertilizer Tour. Learn about the proposed Genesis Fertilizers facility and learn about ownership opportunities, facility progress, and credible partners. The tours start October 28th. Visit genesisfertilizers.com/future to register. That is genesisfertilizers.com/future to get registered for those events that start on October 28th. Well, a lot happening in Washington, D.C. We are like 2 weeks away from the election. It's very close. Anybody that says they know who's going to win, I think is probably more speculating than has the data. It's just depending on which poll you listen to or you believe. This is a close one. Here to talk about some of the agricultural policy impacts leading up to the election and post-election, depending on who becomes the victor, because all of this impacts Canada as one of the major trading partners of the U.S. We are joined by Sara Wyant. She is the CEO and founder of AgriPulse. Sara, it is great to chat with you.
It's my pleasure, Shaun. Thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, lots happening in Washington, D.C. right now. That is definitely not a slow place whatsoever. I guess from an agriculture perspective, we are not too far from the election, just a matter of a couple of weeks. What's happening on the ag policy front are some of the discussions leading into the vote here in early November?
Well, of course, all the ag groups are watching carefully to see not only who's going to win the presidential, but we have very tight races, not only on that front, but in the House and the Senate. There are a lot of folks who will be looking at the Senate to potentially flip to Republican control, and expectations that the House might even flip back to Democratic control. So it's been the other way around, and we're looking at, the possibility of, regardless of who wins, still probably some tight margins. And so we're going to be still difficult to get a lot of things passed if that turns out to be the case. Now, if it turns the other way and perhaps, one party wins the presidential and the House and the Senate, then I think you could see probably some more robust policy agendas. But it's still expected to be a pretty tight all the way around.
Yeah, the last couple of versions of Congress have not exactly been known for their ability to get anything done. It probably would take that kind of supermajority for something, for actual policy to get adopted and passed.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's not likely to happen, just looking at the numbers right now. Although the one thing I think we have to all remember is that so many of us are looking at polls. Some of us might have more favorite polls than others, but if you just look across the board, in 2016 when Donald Trump was first elected president of the United States, Hillary Clinton was 6, maybe more points ahead in most of the polls, and that was dead wrong. 2020, the polls weren't that much better. And so you're looking now at things and thinking, okay, I maybe have some insight from looking at these polls, but I don't think you can count out the fact that there are a lot of voters that don't traditionally show up in polls, and sometimes they show up for elections.
Yeah. That has been definitely one of the issues. I look forward to that night, or maybe a couple days after, depending on how close it is, till we find out who does win the top of the ticket, for sure. What about the farm bill? A lot of people more now talking about a potential of a farm bill being passed in the lame duck session. What's your prognosis on that?
So it's still a possibility. I think there's two things that are weighing in on making it more possible than I perhaps would have expected earlier this year. One is the disasters that we've seen throughout the southeast United States, putting a lot of pressure to do something for the farmers that were hit by that, and then looking at the overall farm economy writ large. In the U.S., you're seeing a lot of softening, growers that are predicted to lose money for the first time in years, and not just $1 or $2. I mean, we're talking about thousands of dollars and cutting into their equity. And so those financial pressures and hurricane pressures are building to do something, whether that's ad hoc disaster alone or it puts enough additional pressure to do a farm bill kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah, Sara, if there is an ad hoc program due to some of the concern, the disaster, like the hurricanes, the two that have gone through Florida, and if you look at farm profitability, if there is an ad hoc program to address that, does that take the pressure and the leverage off getting a farm bill done sooner than later?
Well, the problem with ad hoc disasters historically has been that they are too little too late. They usually don't get through Congress very quickly and then to be administered by USDA. I think that's why there's some discussion about maybe doing a different kind of ad hoc that would be block grants to the states and then let the states administer those. But, how that would work is still unclear as well. So one of the things that we do have that works very well is crop insurance. And so that can pay out more quickly. But of course, not everybody in those disaster hit zones is eligible for crop insurance. And it doesn't help people who have just plain economic losses. There are a lot of fields across the Midwest that are producing huge yields. And so, they've got lots of crop, but it's not worth as much as it should be.
I know that we won't know until, unless it becomes a reality, but we have an idea after the 2016 election what farm policy looked like under a Trump administration. What do you expect from a potential Harris administration, and how will it be different than what we've seen under Biden?
So that's a question I think a lot of people have been asking, and we haven't seen a lot of specifics. To my knowledge, she's not been doing interviews with any agricultural outlets. The one thing that has been done is a submission of answers to a questionnaire by American Farm Bureau that's on their website, so people can look at that, but it tends to be more in generalities. I think there's a couple of things you could point to that would perhaps be a continuation of the Biden administration, and that is the tariffs that have been in place that were a continuation of some of the Trump administration tariffs. On trade policy, I don't think you see a Biden administration or a Harris administration doing something dramatically different than the worker-centric focused trade policy that they have now. Trump, of course, has shown his willingness. His favorite word is tariffs. He shown his willingness to impose those at even higher levels than we've seen in the past. But we have to keep in mind he's also a pretty shrewd negotiator. So how much of those are threats and how much would become reality, we don't know. I think, Shaun, on tax policy, you see considerable differences. Former President Trump wants to continue the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that he was able to get through Congress when he was president, and that is expiring in 2025. And if he can rally together enough of members of Congress to get that through, I think you'll see a big push from the farm community to do so, because it impacts things that are very important, like the estate tax, the 199, all sorts of things that will be impactful on the pocketbook level for farmers and ranchers. Vice President Harris has said that she would not impose higher taxes on anyone making less than $400,000. But above that, she wants to have some rather large tax increases. And it hasn't been clear where she'd be on the estate tax, how much that might change. So we've got some really big issues ahead just on tax policy, which can be as much as impactful, if not more in some cases, than some of the things that we're doing in the Farm Bill.
On both sides of the aisle, fiscal hawks still somewhat extinct. We're still looking to see if they show up at some point, it seems, deficits going forward.
Well, deficits and debt are something that are talked about by some of the fiscal hawks in Congress, but they don't seem to have a large majority that says, no, don't spend that much more money on a new program. And if you look at some of the press releases right now, there are billions of dollars going out into the countryside. That's not unusual during a presidential year, but you see a lot of it being sent out. And I think under a Trump administration, there was no reluctance to send out 28 some billion to compensate for the tariffs that were imposed and the retaliation that we saw. So we don't see anybody raising their hand and say, this has just got to stop, period. But we do hear some conversations about it, because if you look at our federal debt and deficits, they're amazingly large.
Biofuel policy. There's been a lot of people in the countryside and in DC waiting for the details on 45Z, even outside the country. Canadian soybean and canola growers, canola for sure, looking at what some of the final details would be. What is taking so long, the Treasury Department?
Well, I wish the Treasury Department would tell us why it's taking so long and give us some more insights on really, what should be expected, because farmers are, at least in in parts of the US, and I'm sure in Canada too, I mean, you're making decisions for next year, right? And you're trying to figure out, are there going to be all these qualifications, like you have to have a cover crop, or you have to use no-till, and all this criteria that you have to use, or can it be a bundle of different practices? Because cover crops don't work in all parts of American agriculture, Canadian agriculture. So to that extent, we're all looking, the devil in the details situation here to try to figure it out. It's crucial to have that tax credit in order for people to be able to put a pencil down and say, yeah, I think this makes sense. I want to move in this direction. And we all have that tug and pull from the airline industry, and certainly now the Biden administration that wants to do 3 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel by 2030 and 35 billion by 2050. So the interest is there, the desire to farm sustainably is there, but just give some certainty. I think is what growers are really looking for from the Treasury Department.
Due to the imports of used cooking oil, UCO, there's been a bit of a broad brush solution put forth, bipartisan, in I should add to that it only be domestic feedstock that qualifies for some of this programming. Do you think that is likely to happen, or what are your sources saying?
So I know a lot of folks are starting to rally behind this effort to be domestically sourced only. I was recently at a meeting where there's a lot of conversation about that. And if you think about it, taxpayer dollars to support used cooking oil that may be coming in from China, that may not be certified for what it actually is, but falls into this tax credit is concerning to taxpayers. But at the same time, I think Secretary Vilsack has made it pretty clear that he doesn't want to have that kind of a barrier for things like your canola growers. So there's an earthwall debate, because we don't need any new trade wars for American agriculture, or retaliation, or dispute settlements that may be hanging in the balance for months or years.
Yeah. And of course, we have, speaking of trade, we do have July 1st, 2026, where there'll be some sort of, I guess, a deeper look, a review, so to speak, of the USMCA CUSMA trade agreement. I think, there's going to be an election in Canada before then. We've already had the election in Mexico. And of course, we've got the U.S. election in a couple of weeks. We're going to have some new players, and there's going to be a lot of people looking at things like dairy and biofuels, just to name a couple in that timeline.
Biofuels, biotech corn into Mexico. We've also watched former President Trump talk about his desire to have a renegotiation of USMCA and do even a different deal. We don't know exactly what that would look like, but that's got to be causing some concern on both our northern and southern borders as well.
Yeah, what's the speculation on what a President Harris would do on the USMCA? I had one person tell me that they believe nothing. They'll leave it. Another person said they'll try to rip up the whole thing because former President Trump negotiated it. What are you hearing?
I don't see a huge desire out of the administration currently to throw it out. But I do think that there's going to be continued pressure to try to do some of these, resolve some of the disputes that we've been having. Certainly with biotech corn going into Mexico, and the dairy situation with Canada, I think those kinds of goalposts are still desirable.
Yeah, well, I know this, Sarah. There's going to be lots for RealAgriculture and AgriPulse to be writing about and talking about in all this time. So thank you so much for joining me here today. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Shaun.
Along with extra time and lower instances of unpredictable weather, there are a variety of benefits that come with fall ESN application. Learn more by going to smartnitrogen.com. We'll be right back on RealAg Radio, Rural Radio 147, right after this quick break.
Advanced canola trait technology is here. And it's soon to be the talk of the town. Optimum Glide delivers excellent yield potential and agronomic trait performance. Improved crop safety. Enhanced weed control. And a wider window of application. You're going to want to see this. Learn more at OptimumGlide.ca.
Peter Johnson at Wheat Pete, RealAgriculture.com. I'm the host of The Word, and I love doing The Word. I love the questions. I love the challenges. I love having to apply agronomics to all over the globe and areas outside of my normal jurisdiction. Also, I love the feedback the most, where growers challenge me, tell me about their plot results, help me to learn. The Word, absolutely the best part of my day.
We've been talking to Peter Repeat Johnson throughout the past number of weeks about fall weed control. One of the best places to talk about fall weed control is with New Farm. You can do that by going to newfarm.ca, talk to your local retailer, some of your local New Farm reps. Great pre-emergent soil active herbicides like Velterra EZ and Fierce EZ. Get ahead of hard-to-kill weeds. Spray this fall for up to 8 weeks of extended weed control next spring. Like I said, newfarm.ca. Well, we covered some ground today. The U.S. election with Sara Wyant from AgriPulse. Talked about the markets with Jon Driedger from LeftField Commodity Research. These are some testy times for I think, farmers and ranchers. And both from a U.S. perspective and a Canadian perspective. On the cropping side, we've got profitability concerns, major out there. We got a commodity market that hasn't responded the way we want it to. We got costs that are escalated. We're sending out our Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index survey tomorrow, so watch for that in your inbox. And if you're not on our insights panel, you can do that by going to realagristudies.com. I'm interested to see what the perspectives are from people, because I'm detecting, and we've been hearing about it on the Farmer Rapid Fire a lot, is concern. I'm very concerned about my opportunity for profitability here in 24 and 25. Livestock sector, of course, feeling better about themselves, but there's a lot of risks out there right now. We've talked a lot today about the uncertainty on the biofuel front. We've got uncertainty from the trade perspective. That's a big one. A big one. Not only what happens with China and India and some of those other customers, but what happens between Canada and the U.S. And are they going to be trade partners? Of course they're going to be trade partners. But is there friction at that border? Is that border about to get a little bit thicker when we hear about potential 10, 20% tariffs on all goods coming out of Canada into the U.S.? That's a concern. We got concerns about some of the legislation around 45Z being domestic feedstock only, which we really don't know a lot about at this point, just that it's an idea and it's being pushed by multiple sides. But there's also issues working the other way, like, say, Canadian dairy, preventing U.S. product, or that battle over the TRQs, the tariff rate quotas. The U.S. want their access to the Canadian market. Canada, of course, says, "Hey, we're following the rules." The U.S. says no. We got the same sort of issue going on between Canada and New Zealand. A little bit of irony in that. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to cover all of these issues and make sure that you have the information that you need in order to be top of speed and fully informed with all the issues that are happening. So would love to get actually, before we even get to the feedback part, add on top of it some of the domestic issues in Canada. What is happening with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau? This letter of intent, or this, this petition between some of the Liberal MPs in caucus, thinking that he should be stepping down. It's a very secretive list of, I believe, about 30 names. I heard today on the radio that actually, if you sign that letter, you don't know who are the other people that have signed it as well. It's very secretive. What about the Bloc pushing on Bill C-282, for example, in terms of their threat at the end of October? So we don't know exactly when the Canadian election is going to be as well. So there is no shortage of issues to talk about on this show. If you have any feedback, send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Thanks so much, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Radio. And, of course, we'll chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.